Good evening, everyone. I hope that you can all hear me okay. It's great to have you all with us for our event this evening on bringing nature in, biophilic and living design. We're thrilled to have so many of you attending, particularly on a holiday in the UK. So thank you all for joining us. It's also been great to see the engagement that we've had with the questions that have been submitted to date. We've had some really great questions, and I know we're in for an exciting evening. So thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. I'm just going to start by saying a little bit about how the panel will function. We've got a bit of housekeeping to get through, and then we'll turn to the exciting bit of the evening and hearing about biophilic design from our fantastic panelists. Great, so my name is Elizabeth Allen and I'm the chair of this session. I work at the Cambridge Conservation Initiative as the collaboration and engagement manager for the initiative. Joining me this evening, we have Mike Maunder, Ros Wade, John Day, Gary Grant and Munish Datta, and each one of them will get their introduction in due course, but just before they speak. I'd also like to introduce someone whose name is missing from that list, but is absolutely integral to the smooth running of this event, and that is my colleague, Katrin Darsley, who had the original idea for this event and has been working tirelessly to organise us all, and you'll see her name popping up in various places. So huge thanks to Katrin for all her work to date. As I say, today we'll be hearing from each of our panelists in turn by way of scene setting, and we'll then move on to a conversation between our panelists before opening us out to a question and answer session where we hear from you. In order to sort of facilitate that, we ask you please to use the question and answer tab that you should see on your screen. So if you submit your questions through that, as they come to you throughout the presentations, we'll be picking them up a little bit later on. And we'll finish with a brief summary from the panelists, and we're aiming to wrap up at about 9:15. So before we start, I'd just like to run through some housekeeping for our event. As I say, please do submit your questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We've muted the audience members and we'll be using the chat function, which is a different feature to the Q&A, to share links that are referenced by our presenters. So you should have those things to hand rather than having to scribble them down as we go on. As I say, also this event is being recorded, and the recording will be available after the event on the CCI website. And a really important thing that it's also being closed captioned. So if you want to see subtitles for the event, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of the screen. And I believe it's different if you're viewing it on the tablet. It should be on the top of your screen then. Any questions around that, do just let us know in the chat and we can help with anything around that. So that's the housekeeping done. And moving on now to the content of our presentation this evening, I'd just like to start with some opening remarks. And they really focus on the building that you're seeing on the screen here. And were it not for the pandemic that we find ourselves in at the moment, we'd be holding this event in this building, which is the David Attenborough building located in the centre of Cambridge. And I assume that some of you at least will know this building. It's home to the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and it underwent a major refurbishment between 2013 and 2015. Now, the tenants of the building all focus on the conservation of nature as their core work. And so sustainability was absolutely integral to the way the building was refurbished, both throughout and now that we're in the building. It was a really great chance, this refurbishment, to really demonstrate how what at that point was a fairly uninspiring city centre building could be redesigned to make it not only a wonderful place to work, but a building that was significantly reducing its carbon footprint, and also to improve its appeal for the non-human residents. And the photo that you're looking at now is of the Biodiverse green roof, whose design and implementation was overseen by Gary Grant, from whom we'll hear later. And that's one of the big interventions in the building, among a few others, which have really helped to transform it, as I described. We were fortunate to work with a really inspirational project team on the building, including the architects Nicholas Hare, who really bought into our vision for the building and were champions for that vision and for how we made that a reality. And since we moved into the building as the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, we've been working to really further that sustainability agenda for the building. And that's the work that my colleague Catherine has been leading on, and is working to ensure that our intentions at the outset for the building are realised post refurbishment. And although at the time that we were working on the building's refurbishment, we didn't actually use the term biophilic design. In hindsight, I realised that's exactly what we were working on. Biophilia has its origins in Greek and translates simply as love of nature. And what biophilic design is really striving to do is to reference people's innate attraction to nature and natural processes. Biophilic design references nature and natural elements in the materials and the way that buildings function, and it aims to connect the users of a building with the natural world. And there are some really sound studies showing that there are links to increased well-being and productivity for people who work in buildings such as the one you're looking at on your screen now. So with the David Attenborough building, we're just talking about a single building with biophilic interventions. And as we'll hear from the panel, biophilic design can be incorporated into anything ranging from a window box through to huge tracts of land to whole cities. And that's something that our panel will be exploring in more detail. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Mike Maunder, who is the Executive Director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, who's going to kick us off by sharing his reflections on this topic. Mike's early experience of studying horticulture and plant taxonomy led to his developing a love for island endemic plants. While working at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, he developed a set of international plant and habitat conservation partnerships with a focus on East Africa and those aforementioned islands, in this case, oceanic islands. His interest in tropical conservation has seen him work with others, among others, with the National Tropical Botanical Garden in Hawaii, the Fairchild Tropical Botanic Gardens in Miami, and the Eden Project, slightly closer to home. Just a reminder before Mike starts, just to add any questions that you have to that Q&A chat in the screen, and we look forward to hearing from you on that. Right, over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and it's great to join you all. I'm delighted to be in such an eminent company. And Elizabeth, I too want to give reference to Catherine Darsley. Catherine, it was your leadership that's taking the evolution of our building forward. The architectural critic Pevsner described it as violent, the previous building, the Arab designed frame. And I think the architects, Nicholas Hare Architects, have set us off on an evolutionary process where we're moving more and more towards a living building, a biophilic building. And I've been very influenced by an American company called Terraform One, designers in New York, who talk about multi-species clients. And I think that's where we're heading in terms of buildings, cities, suburbs. And we're in an extraordinary change in human society. We're heading towards 10 billion people by 2050. 70% of those will be urban. This has never happened before in our history as a species, and there's really profound consequences for sustainability and conservation. Not only do those cities create a footprint that excludes nature, they draw in huge amounts of resources from all over the planet, whether it's cement, coffee, beef, you name it, soya, oil palm. They also spew out pollutants. And with 70% of the population living in those cities, we anticipate that we've got a commitment. We have a challenge to make those cities livable, to look after the quality of life for those people that live in cities, and that's most of us. We also have a commitment to reduce their impact on biodiversity, and in fact, no longer talk about minimizing damage, but maximizing biodiversity gain. And this is what really excites me, because cities can be extraordinarily vibrant ecosystems that support an enormous amount of nature, and it's letting nature in is the theme of what we're talking about this evening. So I'm very excited to be in on this discussion. We've got some great experts, and I'm looking forward to learning from them. And some of my best nature experiences have been in cities, whether it's watching shark migrations off Miami Beach or extraordinary flocks of wading birds on the Pacific Flyway flying in and out and around Seoul in South Korea. We need to bring nature in, and part of that is to allow nature to subsist. And we're seeing cities squeeze the life out of wild areas. Any of you who've been to Nairobi National Park recently have seen that place just being squeezed to a husk. So I'm really excited about how we can bring nature in, how we can celebrate nature, how we can make the place, our living places, live, and how we can bring nature in and really have vibrant living conditions. And I'd like to move from this picture of our wonderful David Attenborough building, which is both Cambridge Conservation Initiative, all 500 conservationists, and the Zoology Museum, one of the university's treasure chests, and finish with these images. This is one of my favorite cities, Seoul in South Korea, because they're really embracing urban ecology. The recent mayor championed this, and we had conversations a year or two back about how to bring salmon back into Seoul. This is a river right in the middle of the central business district. It was in a pipe under a main road. They opened it up and brought it back to life again. And now you can walk along a vibrant living river, which is a cultural center. Native fish and amphibians and plants are recolonizing it. And this to me is what we're doing. We're rewilding the cities, a little bit of rewilding our lives. And the reason why I chose this is we have a dead canalized river underneath the David Attenborough building. So watch this space. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Mike. That's great. Right, I'm going to hand over to Ros now for our next introduction. Ros works at the Museum of Zoology, where she is the Senior Learning and Engagement Coordinator. As Mike helpfully said, the museum is a neighbour of CCI's within the David Attenborough building. Ros has actually worked in museum learning for over 12 years and leads the learning and public programmes that the museum supports. The museum aims to inspire and empower people to support and protect nature. So you can see it's a really relevant neighbour for us to have within CCI. Their programme also explores the role of nature in supporting well-being, which, as you can imagine, has been a really important strand over the last 12 months in particular. During the pandemic, the museum has been working to provide opportunities, information and activities for people to engage with and encourage the wildlife on their doorstep. So, Ros, over to you.
Hello, thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me to speak this evening as well. So, as Elizabeth said, I run the Learning and Engagement Programme at the Museum of Zoology, and two of our key aims as part of this programme are to support engagement with local wildlife and green spaces, and to empower audiences to take action to protect biodiversity. So it's very relevant to what we're talking about today. And this last year, it's become particularly relevant thinking about the wildlife on our doorstep. We've not been able to go anywhere really to go and spend time in nature. And the well-being benefits of being in nature are so huge. And we really wanted to try and help promote spending time in nature, but from home. So one of the first things we did in April 2020, we launched a brand new blog. And on our blog, we had a whole set of posts called Wildlife from Your Window. And these were really thinking about ways that you can engage with nature without even having to have your own green space. We were very aware of some people not having their own gardens. I'm one of those people, I live in a flat. And so thinking of ways that you can engage with nature, really looking at species that are very common, they're still really interesting, even though they're not rare, things that you're really likely to see. And we also had a lot of how-to guides, one of the most popular of which was our how to build your own mini pond out of a window box, really popular post. And by having an online community gallery, we were able to share some of the pictures of the mini ponds and the insect hotels and things like that that people made and put in their own gardens as well. It was really heartening to see people putting these pieces into their green spaces to really encourage wildlife. Another way that we've been engaging with people during the pandemic, obviously we don't have our own space at the moment, so our events have all moved online as well. And back in June 2020, we had our Zoology Live Festival. We had a whole week of live streams that had interviews with wildlife experts so people could ask questions of them. Lots of different ways that you could really simply explore wildlife using the kind of things that you've got at home. And again, lots of, sort of creative things that you could do, ways of using things that you find outside on your daily walk or in your green spaces to have fun activities, as well as ways that you can encourage wildlife in. Then in December, we followed that up with our 12 Days of Winter Wildlife, slightly different emphasis, how to support and engage with wildlife in the winter months, things that you can do to have a more sustainable festive season as well. So really thinking about what we can do at home to really encourage wildlife. And we are obviously, hopefully, going to be reopening the museum at some point this year, hopefully in the not too distant future. And so starting to think about how our programs move from now. So we'll still maintain our digital presence with events and our blog. But one project I'm really excited for us to get started on is to really start encouraging wildlife to the museum itself. So you might notice on this photograph of our museum that we have a green space. It's not particularly big, but it's probably about the size of a small garden that you might get in an urban area. And we would really like to transform that into a community wildlife garden. So working with people from across the building to design and to garden this space as sustainably as we can to encourage wildlife, and also with interpretation to show people things that they could do at home really simply, without too much money, without too much complex building work and things like that, things that you can do really simply to help encourage wildlife at home. So this is literally watch this space over the next couple of months.
Great, thank you very much for that, Ros. Now I'm going to pass on to John Day, who works at the RSPB as their urban advisor. John is going to talk about swifts, and I just want to say before I give him his biography that the picture that you're looking at, the tower in the background, actually has some swift boxes on it. So we're still sort of within David Attenborough realm, though I'm sure John will take us far beyond that. John's work covers many aspects of the built environment, including promoting nature-friendly design and the landscaping of towns and cities. And he works on that with a whole range of different stakeholders, including green space managers and developers. He's produced guidance documents on topics ranging from nature-friendly design, sustainable urban drainage systems, and nature-friendly green space management. Just a quick reminder as well to keep your questions coming. We've got some great ones coming in. You can also vote if there's a question someone else puts in that you like the sound of, so please do use that function as well. Right, over to you, John.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for giving up your time for this, and also again thanks to Catherine and for pulling this all together. Oh, hang on a minute. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, thanks for everyone that's involved. Yes, in Elizabeth and Catherine in pulling this together as well. So one of our most obviously dynamic birds, I think, in this country, and one that everyone certainly living in town can relate to, is probably the swift. They're an amazing bird, some amazing superlatives about them. I've just listed a few of the amazing things about them here. They've been recorded in level flight as being the fastest bird. Obviously, peregrine is gravity assisted in a stoop. These have been recorded at somewhere in the region of about 69 miles an hour. So that's certainly speeding in a town. So they're pretty good at boy racing. And again, and even at the speeds they enter their nest can be up to sort of 35, 40 miles an hour, which is quite fast, trying to fly and hit and get in a little hole. So amazing birds, amazing agility. When the young leave the nest, they don't actually land to breed. It takes them 3 to 5 years before they breed. During which time they don't actually land, and they just sort of traverse back and forward between the UK or Europe, back down to the Congo where they winter, and spend the winter from August through to April in the Congo. It takes them about a month to get there and back. And then in the middle of that time, during the winter, they actually go and have a Christmas holiday, it seems, in Mozambique. So that's nice for them. Young birds, another thing you can see on the slide there, young birds actually are amazing. To strengthen their flight muscles, they actually do press-ups in the nest and build up the strength, because obviously once they go out of that nest, they don't actually land. So they've got to have to strengthen those wing muscles. And young birds tend to, as well, to avoid risk of predation, tend to leave after dark when they do fledge the nest finally. And they sleep, and swifts do everything on the wing. Basically sleep, mate, and even collect nest material. So it could be bits of fluff, feathers, butterfly wings, bus tickets, whatever. And they'll take them back to the nest and cement them all together with saliva. And obviously once they've finished with the nest, it doesn't take very long for something like that to just disintegrate into dust. Weight wise, they're quite light. I mean, you think a Cadbury's cream egg, as it's Easter, so yeah, they weigh about 40 to 45 grams, which is about approximate weight of a cream egg. And another amazing thing they can do, amongst a huge list, is the young, if food's sort of a bit scarce and we have a cold snap and the parents might be off for quite some time to try and travel some distance as well to get food, the young can actually go into torpor, which is why the actual time of them, the length of incubation can be anything from 19 to 25 days, because obviously they can arrest the incubation of the eggs. And similarly, when they're brooding, the young can be anything from 37 to 56 days in the nest before they leave. So that's that. People do get confused on how to tell them apart. So I've put the other two species. People constantly say, "Oh, I've seen a swift," and then when you obviously speak to them about it, and then so the swallow's quite easy to tell. As you can see, that's the one on the left of the picture. Long tail streamers, or pretty long tail streamers, thin tail streamers. Both swallow and house martin are slighter birds. They're not as chunky as a swift, and you see it's got swept back wings, but it's white underneath, and they're dark blue on their back. And if you see a swallow close enough, you'll see the red throat patch, but that's not always that easy to see. And then house martin's a little dumpy, roundish bird with a very pure white underside, and it's got this distinctive white rump at the base of the back, which you can see in a very sort of short and shallow forked tail there, and the bluey back on. And the swift, as you can see, is basically all dark. It's a sort of dark browny, sooty black, and if you see them close enough, you can see a white, sort of dull, dirty white throat patch on them, but they are all dark, extremely, very, very long scimitar shaped wings and a short forked tail. So they are very easy to tell apart. And they scream. They basically, when they fly around the houses, they make a high pitched screaming noise around above towns and cities, villages, and around rooftops, etc. So very, very distinctive bird, and they fly a hell of a lot faster than the swallow and house martin as well. As I mentioned, they are really the epitome of summer. They're about the last of our migrants to arrive. They start arriving from early May. There was one king bird was seen on the Isle of Wight 2 weeks ago, but they start arriving early May. The adults quickly soon return to their nests. Then we do get another influx of immature birds. As I mentioned, they take 3 to 5 years to actually become mature enough to breed. So there's no rush to come back, but they will still return to the country, to the UK every year, but they don't start turning up until the end of May, right through to the middle or late June even, they'll turn up. Swifts are almost reliant entirely on buildings in which to nest. There are still a few birds that will nest in places like Milan Cove, in the caves there, and there are apparently some birds breeding in Caledonian pines in Abernethy forests, but they've obviously followed man. Once man started living in buildings, and they've just adapted a life to almost being almost entirely reliant on buildings, and they will return to a nest year after year after year. Average age is around 9 years, and they have sort of 2 to 3 eggs a year, 2 to 3 young, but each generation will return to the same nest, and they're so fixated on that nest hole, even if you move it a foot, apparently it completely confuses them. So yeah, they're really passionate about their nest site site faithful. Problem with swifts at the moment, they've been in a massive steep decline. You can see there a couple of figures pulled off from the British Trust for Ornithology there. It's the period 95 to 2018 is over 58% decline. And in a short period as well, the 10 years between 2008 and 28, it's actually a 40% decline. And on average, they're now declining around about 4% per year. Because of their lifestyle, we don't know the full reasons of why they're declining. Obviously, a migratory bird, there could be problems in the Congo and the wintering grounds. But we do know in this country, one of the main problems is loss of nest sites. There is also, obviously, we know in Europe there are declining invertebrate biomass. So again, that's probably having an effect as well. And so we also know, obviously, loss of nest sites. So some of their traditional nest sites that they've been site faithful to for years will either be demolished or renovated, holes blocked up, etc. And obviously, we need houses that are really good at carbon reduction, but that doesn't allow birds like swifts in. But as you'll see, we can get onto that. Swifts are really, such a popular species, and there's now a growing network of swift interest groups, people that are just really so passionate about them. There's more than 80 groups now in the country, and they're called the Swift Local Network, SLN there. Each year now for the past 3 years, I think this year's the 4th year, there's Swift Awareness Weeks. And again, that's getting increasingly popular year on year. And this year's one just date for you to keep an eye on there. The Swift Awareness Week is 3rd to 11th of July. Recent survey in the last couple of years by an MSc student on people's perceptions and how they feel about having birds nesting in houses. Was 75% of householders actually thought having swift nest bricks and bat bricks in houses was a really good idea. And then about 24% wasn't bothered one way or the other, whether there were boxes or not. So it was really positive. And there's a few things you can do to help them. Then there's a Swift Mapper system, which records where swifts breed, or you can record where you see screaming parties, because they fly very low over buildings. So screaming parties, or where you actually, if you're lucky enough to find a nest, which is not easy, you can fit, and there should be links, proper links being put up for you there. I know there's some on the screen, but there should be sort of more other links being put up. There's also, you can fit integral nest boxes, or when you're either doing an extension or refurbishment or new buildings. And then there's external nest boxes as well that you can put on as a retrofit. And also that you can as well, if you keep an eye on your local planning applications, there are letter templates on the Swift Conservation website, and there's different letter templates for different situations. And then as instructions on what to do, you can actually write to the local planning authority, citing the particular planning application and asking them to make sure that they put swift bricks into the building. Or if you're that really interested and really keen, you can find the map that's got all the pins in where all the local Swift network groups are, or start your own one up. Get in touch with one of the groups and say, there's not one in my area, I'd like to start one up. Can you give me some help? And they're already friendly in there because they're just so dead passionate about the subject.
Wonderful, thank you very much, John. Just slight umbrage taken on behalf of the house martin being described as dumpy there, which seems slightly unfair. We'll take that offline maybe later. Right, I'd now like to introduce Gary Grant, who's already been mentioned in conjunction with his fantastic work on the David Attenborough building during its refurbishment and since then indeed as well. So Gary is a director of the Green Infrastructure Consultancy, and he works on urban greening as part of that. As I said, Gary has played a key role in designing our roof, but also some of the other interventions that we have within the David Attenborough building, including the living wall that we have, the sort of triple floor height living wall that we have inside the David Attenborough building. So other projects that Gary has worked on include the Biodiversity Action Plan for the Olympic Park in London, various green infrastructure strategies, including in the Black Country, Swansea and South Essex, and the design of numerous green roofs, walls and rain gardens. And I can see that Gary's been active answering some of our questions already, particularly around that kind of practical end of how you install green roofs like this on other buildings. So over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I've got 5 minutes to really rattle through some slides which will summarize the benefits of urban green infrastructure and what we're calling nature-based solutions in cities. And then I'm going to give you a few examples. So it will be rapid fire, and we don't have time to dwell on the details and to look in detail at the evidence, but there is a huge amount of evidence now that's been compiled to show the benefits and confirm them. Now, the first slide shows you the Bosco Verticali in Milan by Stefano Boeri, who is one of the first architects to conceive a building knowing that it will be festooned with vegetation. So this changes architecture, because to date we've tended to put it on a building, but Stefano wants to bring as much vegetation to a building as he possibly can for various reasons. So we're in a really interesting stage now of the development of these ideas. Next slide, please, Catherine. So just a reminder, you probably don't need it, but we have a global emergency with biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on. And greening cities really will help to reduce some of those effects and reverse some of them in the long term as well. So it's a really important issue, this. Now, the next slide, Catherine, is just this summary of all these benefits, if you like. So cities are hotter, they're drier, they're more prone to flooding and more polluted and noisier and so on than the hinterland. And what researchers are finding is that more soil, water and vegetation, in other words, green infrastructure as we're calling it, within cities alleviates or solves these problems. And we'll just very quickly touch on some of those. So the next slide is really just to say that there's a lot of work that's going into planning green infrastructure and thinking about how to maximize the benefits and how to get green infrastructure to work together in networks for people and wildlife. So quite a bit of work's being done on that. And the next slide shows you some of the work that's being done now to encourage biodiversity into cities, to look at networks, to look at stepping stone effects, because you can imagine there are insects, for instance, that hop from one patch to another, so we can plan for that. There's lots of guidance available about making things better connected. We can encourage nature by using plant species, the native plant species, or species with a documented value for biodiversity. So there's a whole piece of work on urban biodiversity, which feeds into our urban greening agenda as well. So the next slide, if I remember correctly, is really the latest thinking now on urban greening, is the benefits for health. We always knew that encouraging exercise through having parks nearby was good, but we're now seeing a lot of mental health benefits, lowered blood pressure. We've got people putting children in scanners, children that are in schools in the Netherlands with no vegetation and children in schools with vegetation. They're popping these children in scanners, and they're finding that even things like brain development in children is affected by having vegetation around all the time. So, you know, these things are real, and there's lots of really interesting and quite scary research that shows that we absolutely need soil, water and vegetation around us in cities as well as everywhere else. So this is looking at dealing with heat waves and summer heat, which of course kills people. So just before we go to the thermal image, just make a mental note of this. This is in Osaka in Japan. You've got a roof garden, but you've also got railways and roads and so on. And the next slide shows you that the temperature differential between a roof garden and a grey roof or a road is more than 20 degrees centigrade in the middle of summer, in the middle of a hot day. So green infrastructure cools the city. It's the way of dealing with the urban heat island effect. It will save lives, and it will save energy on air conditioning, and it will save on carbon. Plenty of advice and research on that. So the other thing is that, you know, one of the important things that's happening with green roofs, for instance, in summer, is that they're evaporating and transpiring water, which is cooling, evaporative cooling. And we need to hold water in the city. So business as usual is getting rid of water into pipes. We want to reverse that. And the next slide shows us the sponge city, where, as Mike showed, we're taking rivers that were in pipes, bringing to the surface. We're harvesting rainwater for irrigation and reuse for things like flushing toilets. We're improving parks, we're making parks, and we're retrofitting the whole of the city with more soil, water, and vegetation wherever we can, to reduce the risk of flood, to clean up our rivers because of all the pollutants that are being intercepted, and of course getting that cooling that we've already learnt about. And you know, what does the sponge city mean? Well, it means sustainable drainage, and that's that next slide, please, Catherine. Sorry about that. So what does that mean, the sponge city? It means thousands of little interventions, rain gardens, and it's starting to happen now in the UK. We've got some terrific examples. So that means other people who are yet to try this can get the confidence by seeing what's going on in places like Cardiff and London and elsewhere. And some of these are tiny projects where school children are literally planting the rain gardens, which, you know, are there to reduce flooding, but they're also bringing all these other benefits. Next slide. And it can be on the level, the sponge city and sustainable drainage, reducing flood, can be on the level of simply a downpipe disconnection planter, which stores a bit of water before it overflows into the drains. And cumulatively, these projects can reduce flooding and provide a little bit of extra, but for biodiversity, a project for schools in many cases and residents, somewhere to grow vegetation. Even when you're told there's nowhere to do anything, a downpipe disconnection planter might be the way forward. So I'm getting towards the end. So I want to talk about green roofs. London has been very positive about this. The Mayor of London, more than 10 years ago, issued a policy expecting green roofs. And so we've got now 1.2 million square meters of green roofs in London. And now the issue is about quality. So we want the sponge city, we want deeper soils on roofs, we want more diversity. And there is a tendency for people to put monocultures, in this case, a sedum blanket. This is the default extensive green roof. We don't really want that. What we want, as you'll see in the next slide, is a biodiverse green roof where we've got dozens of species, drought tolerant. It's still low maintenance, but it's holding more water as well. There's a deeper substrate, a growing medium there. So there's a bit of work being done on quality of these things. And the next slide shows you that even when it's just an office terrace, people can put features like insect hotels. This is for solitary bees. On their terrace where they have their lunch. We have gardening clubs springing up where office workers are maintaining these features. And what's really interesting for the corporate side is that getting people involved in these things reduces staff turnover, which is worth a lot of money to companies. And then the next slide is greening the vertical. So we've got lots of really interesting ways of greening the vertical now. This is a hotel in London, which was a brick wall. We had hotel guest rooms behind that, which were overheating in summer. They're now much cooler, so the air conditioners aren't running. We're harvesting rainwater to irrigate this, which is also a good thing, of course. And this particular wall, which was one I designed about 10 years ago now, included a lot of plants to attract pollinating insects as well. So, you know, these aren't just about aesthetics, it's about wildlife, it's about cooling and so on. And then finally, this is a project which goes by the name Biophilic Living, which I'm working on in Swansea. It's been given planning permission. It's a refurbishment of an old Woolworths, which will have some cross-laminated timber structures above it for social housing, offices, and so on. It'll have greenhouses for people to grow vegetables. It'll have gardens. It'll have trees on the building, green roofs, blue roofs to intercept rainwater before it hits the drains, because there's a requirement in Wales, a legal requirement for that. So this is all starting to happen now. Architects are really embracing this, and we're really starting to see the whole thing take off. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary. Before I come to our last panelist today, Munish Datta, I'd just like to issue the last reminder for you all to put your questions into the Q&A. I'm also thrilled to see that some people are answering other people's questions, which makes my role as chair somewhat redundant, which is great. So keep that coming as well. It's really nice to see that supportive community that we have amongst the audience. Right, so as I say, last panelist for now, by no means least, Munish Datta, who is the director at the UK Green Building Council, whose mission it is to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. Munish is also a fellow at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, where he empowers senior business leaders and organisations to tackle the critical global challenges of our time. Previously, Munish has led teams to design and deliver the multi-award-winning sustainability strategy Plan A that Marks and Spencer's implemented a few years back for its property portfolio, which extends to over 1,000 buildings, I believe. So Munish, over to you. And I know you're driving your slides. Are you all right with all of that?
I hope so. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Perfect. Okay, go for it.
I'm just going to try and share slides, and then hopefully you can see them there. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much to Cambridge Conservation Initiative and Mike and the team, Elizabeth, Catherine, for inviting me this evening, and happy Easter to everyone. It's really wonderful to join such an eminent panel to talk about this really important topic. So yes, UK Green Building Council are a small influential charity working right across the property value chain with some 530 members from investors, developers, designers, contractors, occupiers, maintainers, the full value chain. And we are doing some really interesting work on what we're calling nature-based solutions, which are very much along the theme of what you've heard so far. And this is our mission. This is why we exist. This is what gets us out of bed, which is to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment right across its whole value chain. And why that's really important to us is we fundamentally believe that unless you tackle this issue at every point of a property's life cycle, with every role and actor in that chain, you cannot achieve that radical sustainability. So really important. And we're at a really interesting time. We're 14 years old, and for 12 years of that, we spent really trying to convince the industry about why we were in such a difficult climate and biodiversity crisis, and the contribution that the industry has in terms of mitigating that crisis. But the last 2 years, whether it be due to society or due to business or due to government levers, has been a real tipping point. And in the last 12 months, that's accelerated beyond imagination. And we're no longer now having to answer why. It's more about the how, it's the when and with whom. And it's very much around solutions, and nature-based solutions are very much at the heart of the solutions to our climate and biodiversity crisis, and to recover our economy and to recover our planet. So, and that I just want to set this sort of context. You know, these have already been mentioned, but we are in a very difficult moment. And we are seeing some responses. We are seeing, for example, 75% of local authorities in the UK are formally declaring a state of climate emergency to consider more seriously and swiftly the critical risks that are facing our communities. And just to bring those risks to the fore, 5.2 million buildings in the UK are at risk of flooding at the moment. And that's a £7 billion cost just from 4 major flood events between 2000 and 2016. And almost very sadly, 1,500 people have lost their lives due to 2 heat waves since 2000. And this isn't going to change. We believe that the UK is set to suffer an estimated 7,000 deaths a year from overheating by 2050. But we believe there's a huge opportunity to mitigate some of these risks. There is a groundswell of support for parks and green spaces, which must be capitalized upon by a wide range of built environment stakeholders. And nature-based solutions should be at the forefront of creating an equitable and resilient post-COVID recovery. In fact, COVID, I think, has highlighted the crucial role and function of nature, particularly in urban areas, for recreation, relaxation, stress relief and exercise. Arguably, I think there's been a real re-evaluation of nature's value as publicly available green spaces become the cornerstone of social interaction in these periods of lockdown and bubbles. The only outlet we've really had in the last 12 months or so to enjoy relatively freely without sort of the constraints we've been under. And we've done some work, we've actually interviewed in a project that we're involved in Greater Manchester called Ignition, over 2,000 residents of Greater Manchester, and found that they valued public parks and green spaces very highly, as you can see on this slide with the statistics, and much more highly than before the pandemic. These statistics are strong evidence, we believe, about the public appetite for nature. But we have faced some challenges around implementing these solutions, urban nature-based solutions, abbreviated here to MBS. It's faced a number of challenges in relation to its position within policy and practice. Without formal requirements, it often remains a nice to have rather than a critical form of infrastructure. Within both policy and practice, there still persists a lack of awareness and understanding both within and between organizations, both in the public and private sector. Practically, there are challenges regarding capital expenditure and operational expenditure associated with NBS implementation and their long-term maintenance and management. Crucially, much of the focus remains on interventions with new developments over the opportunities that may lie actually within the existing stock of potentially existing infrastructure retrofits. And it was great to hear of that Woolworths example that Gary just spoke about. So at UKGBC, we are currently undertaking major projects that are near completion that approach nature-based solutions delivery and management with private and public sector perspectives, taking on board the views of our many members. And the first output of these programs is a report that we will launch at the end of this month, and hopefully there'll be a link in the chat now to enable you to join us about principles for delivering nature-based solutions. And this report will aim to talk about how we can incentivize stakeholders to more seriously consider nature-based solutions as a means of abating climatic and ecological risks and initiating a green and equitable post-COVID recovery. The ease by which these stakeholders can accommodate nature-based solutions within operations at both strategic and asset project level, and also to enhance the delivery of nature-based solutions both between new and existing infrastructure retrofits. So please do join us on the 29th of April for that event. And of course, it's been mentioned already, but during the pandemic, we've rediscovered nature and the value. Therefore, we placed more value on our access to green space than ever before. And here is some interesting data from the Office of National Statistics that UK homes close to parks, gardens, playing fields, and other publicly accessible green spaces in urban areas of England and Wales are more valuable in terms of, are more expensive than would be if they're further away. A latest estimate by the Office of National Statistics the value of UK natural capital, these exemplified by some of these green spaces, is £1 trillion. But the pandemic has also highlighted inequalities in terms of access to green space. Here's a graphic that shows that across different cities in the UK. So we have some choices to make on how we plan our urbanization, how we will use up potentially freed up space and have a living design and community. And perhaps this visualization brings that to life. I really like this vision of London. I mean, who wouldn't? And just to bring my own experience of this to fore, and Gary, you'll recognize this because you, at my time at Marks and Spencer, you helped us, in fact, to put some of this in place. Here are some examples of Marks and Spencer stores applying the biodiversity guide that we created onto existing and new stores. And I'm sure you'll all agree that the facades of these stores are much more attractive than what was there before. They made the colleagues and customers that walked into these stores proud of the buildings they were entering, and they affected positively the sustainable behaviors of people that worked in them. So with that, I'll conclude. We have some very important work in terms of nature-based solutions and urban rewilding happening at UKGBC. You can contact us to participate in that, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Manish. I'd now like to invite all the panelists to unmute and unvideo themselves so that we can just have a chat together before kind of opening out to the questions that we've been receiving from the audience. Given time, I'm going to propose that we just think about kind of a couple of questions and then look at some of the things that have been coming in from our audience. So I'd like to kick off with a question, and I guess it kind of hooks onto that lovely visualization that Manish shared. And indeed to all the things that you've been sharing. You know, this sounds like a no-brainer, really. Just the benefits are legion, as you've all described, you know, from cooling, well-being, you know, kind of biodiversity. So why are we not seeing this more kind of across the board? You know, you've mentioned, I think Gary mentioned that it's a legal requirement in Wales. They're kind of building these things in. London's also kind of sounds like it's quite ahead of the game. I know in parts of Europe, green roofs are kind of more mandatory on new builds and so on. So who do we need to convince? And I suppose the kind of aligned question to that is, are there people within our own community, the broad church of kind of conservation, environment, sustainability, who may think differently about this? So can we start on the inside, as it were, within conservation, and then kind of who do we need to reach out to more broadly to that? I think I'm going to pick on Gary to go first on that, and then perhaps other panelists, if you can chip in with that, please.
Well, as you say, Elizabeth, things are not perhaps as obvious as they should be, because things like green roofs are not highly visible. So we walk around the streets and we may not know that there are green roofs on buildings. As I say, there are now 1.2 million square meters of green roofs in central London. And people often say to me, why can't we be more like Paris, where they have green roofs? And I tell them, we actually, in London, we have more green roofs than Paris. We've just quietly done that. We don't necessarily promote it. But of course, there's more to this than green roofs. And greening the streets is really a frontier now, which, you know, there is movement on, because as we're seeing with improved cycleways, pedestrianisation, low traffic neighbourhoods. So there is a lot of interest in this, and I think we are starting to see some changes in that. So, you know, I think we're in a transition period, and you know, I'm very positive now, and nearly all of the technical questions that people ask, you know, I've been promoting green roofs since 1990 now, and, you know, most of the questions people ask when they've never come across this before have been answered satisfactorily to the, you know, for people, you know, the technical people, the policy people. So we've got most of the answers. We know how to do it. So we've just got to take a few more people with us. And, you know, I'm very positive about that. But of course, there are particular difficulties with particular types of intervention and certain locations and so on. Of course there are. But you know, we've got a good package now of knowledge and good examples. We've got the policy, the evidence, so it's looking good.
Great, thank you, Gary. Anyone else want to add to that?
After you, Mike.
Oh, Manish, please go on. Go on.
Sorry I don't know what the right etiquette is in these moments, but yes. So I just want to build on what Gary's just said there. I think we've had a big knowledge gap basically about this. There's been a lot of misinformation about costs, maintenance costs, about technical issues, and one of the big aims of our work is to improve the knowledge and improve the knowledge via case study. So what is happening on real assets like the David Attenborough building and the many that are, that we've all shown and discussed today, what is the impact of those? So that's the first thing. I think there's also been up till recently a policy gap, but we're now seeing through things like net biodiversity gain policy, et cetera, that's been closed. And lastly, there's an economic gap. There is an undervaluing of these types of interventions. But as I've demonstrated, hopefully in my slides, the value of those is now coming through really strongly. And so developers are starting to see, whether it's for existing assets or new assets, that actually adding this green and blue infrastructure that we've not talked about today can enhance the value of the asset. And at the moment, we'll all know that there's quite a bit of debate happening about the role of, for example, offices in the future, as we've all learned to work in different ways. Well, we'll need to make them more attractive. We'll need to make them more experiential. We want people to come to them. And one of those big attractive parts of coming to them to enhance that experience will be things like green infrastructure. I'm very convinced about that. And I think the last thing I'll just say is that, yes, there's a lot of focus on carbon. And of course, all these things that we've talked about, sequester carbon, they clean pollution, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, there's a on my dashboard, there's a very big bright light on biodiversity breakdown as well. And so these kinds of assets are going to help mitigate some of that breakdown. So I hope that, from a commercial point of view, from a policy point of view, and from a knowledge point of view, those gaps are going to close very quickly. And through examples, we can really promote the introduction of green infrastructure very quickly.
Mike, thank you, Manish.
I'm going to add one more gap to Manish's analysis. And this is something Gary's talked about previously, joined up urban design we're still working out how to do it and to get the different professions to work together. And where it does work in places like Singapore, you get spectacular urban greening. And there you've got all the ministries working towards one objective, and that is to make Singapore livable. And Manish is right about the biodiversity. It also brings joy, and we can't undervalue that. It brings delight and pleasure into its cities, and cities are designed for humans to live in high densities. So we need that joy, and we need that stimulation of a living environment.
Thank you, Mike. Ros or John, anything that you'd like to add to this?
No, I think I just agree with the idea of that well-being and that joy that you get from being in a much
Ros, I don't know if others are having the same, but we're not catching all what you're saying.
I was just agreeing with what Mike was saying about bringing joy to those urban spaces being very important. Yeah.
Great, and it strikes me, I'll come to John in a second, that there's a big communications piece around this also. I think Gary's point that roofs are high up, we don't them. And I guess that's thinking about what the museum is doing, a core strand of your work to kind of bring this to kind of people from all walks of life. So it's a kind of really important thing that's happening with the museum. John, would you like to add anything to this?
No, I think obviously, as Gary and others have pointed out, we now have the knowledge, and it is just now trying to get that sort of information out there and persuade the decision makers to actually act on this. It's all doable stuff. It's just that getting over that inertia, I think, but we're getting there, as people have said.
Thank you very much. again, given our time, I suggest we are now going to move on to take some of the questions that we've been having coming in from our audience. We've got a huge array. There's absolutely no way we're going to be able to cover everything. I'm pleased to see, as I say, that some audience members and our panelists have been answering questions as we've been going along. But in advance, apologies that we won't be able to cover everything that we're looking at. I'd like to pick up with a strand that's coming through and has been kind of upvoted across the board. It looks like, it feels like the people who are with us today are really interested in things that they can do practically. And that's very much in keeping with Earth Optimism and the Solutions Fair that this talk is a part of. I think what's kind of been put across is that there are lots of different things that we could be doing, and we've seen some pictures of those as well. But I think we have a question, our top voted question is what biophilic initiative have you found to be the most effective, and where would you start with incorporating biophilic principles into a home, an office, or whatever? So I'm going to start with Munish on that, please.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think there can be really simple things, I suppose, is the best way to answer that. And I think the very last slide that Gary showed, which is, I think was on balconies of flats, if I'm not mistaken, Gary, which was a really simple solution, can make quite a big difference. Some of our members have been adding, the right type of plants in indoor spaces. That's not very expensive. That's easy to maintain. That's not a whopping great green wall on the facade of a building. And that's made a huge difference. So I think some of the most simple solutions are often the most effective and most convincing, because they don't require a huge amount of investment. And that can then build onto bigger and bigger, sort of more complex infrastructural interventions, because we get encouragement and we get confidence from those. But yeah, for me, simplicity and the smaller things in buildings have been sometimes the most effective from my experience.
Great, thank you. Ros, I'm sure that you've got lots that you could say on this, given all the work the museum's been doing, particularly over the last year. If you had to pick one thing to encourage people to do, what would that one thing be?
Oh, can I choose two, actually? There are two that I would say are really key. One is in any space that you've got outside is to provide water. So sort of a pond or a bird bath or something like that is so supportive of wildlife. And the other is to not be too tidy as well, and to leave some bits that are a little bit wild, and make sure you've got some nettles for your caterpillars to feed on, and you've got leaf mold and things like that available. So they're quite simple things. It doesn't take too much to do, and it does so much to encourage wildlife in your own green space.
Great, thank you very much, Ros. So coming back down the list of questions we've been asked, we've gone from kind of the very practical things that we can do in our own homes and gardens, to a question about planetary overpopulation, which is obviously something that we all think about a lot in our day jobs as conservationists. The question is, isn't this a real problem? And I think it's probably safe to say that we're aware that this is a problem. And how would you say that sort of biophilia can help us? We need to live as part of nature, as the questioner has asked, and perhaps you can reflect on how the biophilic city can help us do that. Mike, do you want to pick up on that question first?
Yeah, that's a stonker, isn't it? I think by making cities more amenable, making cities more sustainable, we're providing homes for more people in a way that is equitable and humane, and where society can flourish. The city is where we should be having our most should be culturally rich, should be hives of economic activity. But if we look at the cities as living systems, we'll start making them more sustainable. We'll start thinking about our impact on the hinterland that supports our cities. And above all, we'll give people a decent, healthy life, rather than not so long ago in London, 1840s, air pollution killed virtually every plant in the city. You had to grow plants in Wardian cases to support plants in central London. We've moved now, we've got to keep an eye on pollution. But I would say biophilic design is both about bringing nature in and bringing nature into the benefit of humans, so that we can live decent lives in cities and celebrate who we are.
Great, thank you, Mike. Coming back to a more practical bent, we've had quite a lot of questions around cost and what the implications are for greening our cities around cost. I think someone mentioned that, you know, the fact that a hotel has been able to green a wall, obviously that's a revenue generating business. I'm looking to Gary really to kind of share a little bit of his perspective on what the cost implications are of greening a city, and how we can ensure that you know, those are born equitably and are kind of truly represented as well, I think. So Gary, over to you, please.
Yeah, well, the first thing to bear in mind, of course, is that the benefits of urban greening, which we've described briefly, they save money, if you like, and they improve health, which saves money. They reduce energy consumption, which saves money. They reduce flood risk, which obviously costs a fortune. But the difficulty often is that those cost benefits are enjoyed by different people to the people who might be investing in the green infrastructure. So that's where the disconnect is. But overall, to society, there's a financial benefit to using green infrastructure. When you get to the detail of things like a sustainable urban drainage, that's been shown through detailed analysis that it's cheaper for capital expenditure and it's cheaper for maintenance as well. So there's been detailed work that's been done on that. So things like sustainable drainage features to you know, rain gardens and so on actually do pay for themselves. So you know, you've got to put all that into context, that we all benefit. But when you get down to a specific building, what we're finding now more and more is that people are not talking about the cost. They used to complain, developers used to complain bitterly, saying, you know, this is an extra burden, it's a cost, we can't afford it. But when you really look at the detail of that cost, you find it's not really a very large proportion of the cost of the building. So for example, I was working on a project in the City of London where the developer said he did not want to put green infrastructure on that building because it was too expensive. And so they were appealing against the requirement from the City of London Corporation to green that building. But when we looked at the cost of the building cost £200 million to build. And the greening, which was being requested by the City of London, would cost £29,000. So, you know, that £29,000 is less than the cost of the carpets in one floor of that building. If that developer had been asked to change cladding from aluminium to stainless steel at the cost of a few £1,000,000, they would have done it. So really, this idea it's too expensive is not really borne out by the detailed examination of, you know, of that. But of course, individual householders may struggle to find the money to do all of these things. Of course, I understand that. But in general, what people need to understand is that the built environment costs a fortune to build and to maintain, and huge sums of money are being spent. So the small amounts that we would be spending on green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, nature-based solutions, whatever it might be, it's insignificant when you come down to the big picture. So beware of people complaining about that. They're probably people that just don't want to be bothered to change the way that they work, or maybe they didn't have a column in their spreadsheet yet for that. But you know, once that column is created, all this magically goes away. And I can confirm that because I'm working on projects now where no one is even talking about the cost of the green roof, the green wall. It's not even discussed anymore.
Great, that's a really hopeful note. Thank you, Gary. Munish, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, if I may, I think Gary's made a very powerful argument about cost. I actually want to make a powerful argument about benefit and put some numbers to it. And I will put a link into the chat in a minute to a report which brings this evidence, where you can sort of delve into the evidence. But we've been doing work, as I mentioned, in Manchester and we've been working with Greater Manchester Authority and many other stakeholders to look at what the sort of benefits are of certain types of green infrastructure. So let's just take street trees. We found, for example, that having street trees increased restaurant patronage on those streets by up to 50%. We found that they enable a 3-degree reduction in temperature. Now, that's really significant because in the future, as we have urban heating in particular, having things like street trees is going to be critical. In fact, a tree on a sunny day can be as effective as taking 10 air conditioning units out of use. And that's based on real strong evidence. If I then look at things like a green roof, again, from this report, 6.7% energy savings for the space directly below a green roof, 6.9% uplift of property value by an accessible green roof, noise reduction benefits as well if you're in a really strong urban location, and so on and so forth. So I think these benefits are, it's really important that we dial up the value and the commercial benefits we get from these assets, from these interventions, and focus perhaps less on the cost, because we've been focused too much on the cost in the past. The other thing I'd just add is, we are now entering into a race to zero carbon. And one of the things that I think will be really interesting in the future is how, because of their carbon sequestration features of green infrastructure, how we can link that to local carbon offsetting, and how we can create a economic case, a product that will support the race to net zero through purchasing offsets from green infrastructure that is around us, local to us, that can connect communities to that infrastructure, that can become much more meaningful than, for example, investing in something that's overseas that you can't see, feel, connect to. So just a couple of ideas there from me.
Thank you very much, Manish, for answering. That's really good to hear. So we're very much kind of heading to the end of our event, which is quite extraordinary how quickly the time has passed. And there are so many questions that I wish we had more time for, because we've got a really kind of fantastic array of questions. We'll do a bit of thinking as a panel about how we might kind of think about some of those questions in the future as well, because I think there's stuff in there, particularly around the communication, how we're sharing this information as well, that I think could be really relevant. But at this point, what I would like to do is invite the panel in 30 seconds or less, just to share one take-home message for our audience, just a note to leave us on as we close. So I'm going to start with Ros for that one, please.
One take-home message. I think it's to really appreciate the green spaces that are around you, and the amount that they give us as well, and learning that little bit about it. This is obviously the work that we do in the museum, is helping people to find out that little bit about their local wildlife and their local green spaces, and how much joy you can get out of that. So that's one of my take-homes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ros. John.
Right, is that on now? Yeah.
It is, yeah, we can hear you.
So, yeah, obviously in terms of Swifts in my presentation, yeah, put up Swift boxes, as many of them as possible, or pester the local planning authority to get them into a local development near you. So yeah, get them, yeah.
Thank you, John. And I know Katrin shared some really helpful links on that, so hopefully the audience can get onto that and start the pestering process in time for this year's Swift season. That would be fantastic. Thank you. Mike.
Look at every piece of green space, whether it's a wall, a roof, a park, and challenge yourself, how much biodiversity can I actually squeeze into this space? So 6 months ago, I did a workshop with biologists and landscape architects in Hong Kong, and we looked at key performance indicators for public parks. We came up with a new one. How many tons of aphids does your public park produce in a year to feed insectivorous birds? Bring life back, squeeze it in.
Thank you, Mike. Gary.
So in a way, it's similar to Mike's message. Where we see masonry, asphalt, sealed surfaces, where it's grey, if you like. Do we really have to keep it grey? And can we make it green by bringing more soil, vegetation and water into the city? Just keep that in mind and you will start to see opportunities everywhere.
Thank you, Gary. And finally, Munish.
I'm going to conclude with a social point, because I've probably been going on about the commercial bits of this a bit too much during this panel. I think it's really important for us to realise that we don't live in an equal society that has equal access to green space in every city, in every country. But I think what we've discussed today and the solutions that we've shared in the many different ways that we can integrate green space can actually bring better equity in society, particularly in access to nature. Our children, every child deserves strong access to nature. And by deploying urban rewilding, urban nature-based solutions, we can provide that access.
Great, that's a fantastic to end on. Thank you very, very much. So now my last task is just to say many thanks to many people, but I'll keep it brief. So firstly, I'd just like to thank our 5 speakers this evening, Munish, Gary, John, Ros and Mike. We've covered a huge amount of ground in a short space of time, ranging from the very small to the very large. And I think the level of inspiration, aspiration and kind of ability that we have together to make a difference has really come through in what you've presented for us. So thank you so much for that. I'd also like to thank those who have been involved in organising Earth Optimism, of which this is a part. A huge amount of work has gone into that, and there is a huge number of fantastic talks that have happened, that are still available to watch, and also that are happening over the next week, so do tune into them. There's also a number of sponsors, as you can see on your screen now, without whom Earth Optimism would not have been possible. Coming on to organisers, a tremendous thanks to Katrin for organising us, for handling questions, and for being fantastic, helping us with our sustainability within the David Attenborough building. We're really indebted to you, Katrin, so thank you for that. And also finally, just to thank our audience for coming along on Good Friday, taking part so enthusiastically, and just being an inspirational bunch as well. Like, I think it's so heartening for us all to see how much passion and knowledge and enthusiasm there is out there. I think it really is really heartening, and I think very much in spirit with Earth Optimism. I think we can certainly be optimistic on that front. So thank you all ever so much, and enjoy the Easter weekend. Goodbye.